Hello. We're picking up here with Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity. If you remember last time, I had talked about Beauvoir's analysis of childhood and its development into adulthood, where, of course, the child is free, but its freedom is not fully effective in the world. Its freedom is bound up in play, and the major structuring forces in the child's life are the parents. It eats what the parents give it. It goes to school where it lives. The child has no control over those big projects that are shaping it. And from the perspective of the child, the parents offer these values that are writ into the fabric of reality. They exist out there in the world as if it's a fact of the world. And it's only when the child grows that it begins to question these values, and the child begins to realize, especially in adolescence, in that rebellious phase, that, oh, these adults are basically making it up as they go along. As the child recognizes its freedom and subjectivity, it begins to recognize that of others. You can't question the values that your parents give them unless you realize that they are themselves a subjectivity that's projecting values in the world, and so on and so forth. Of course, the adolescence doesn't necessarily articulate it in that theoretical way, but it's this sort of intuitive or pre-theoretical understanding of another person as having projects and a future that's open to them, and so on. Now, here we've really been introduced to this term seriousness, and seriousness, in the way that Beauvoir talks about it here, is always about how we relate to values and how we understand our own role in the creation of values. The serious person takes the values that they adopted to be a transcendental absolute that exists independently of human activity or anything like that. It is a good, capital G good, or a capital C cause out there in the world. And because it exists out there in the world, there's an element of compulsion to it, right? Once you recognize that it's good, you're compelled to follow it almost. You have to, in a sense. It becomes necessary. And so it alleviates you of having to choose, of having to justify values on your own terms. You can just point to it out there and say, well, see, it's a thing. It exists, right? So for, of course, Beauvoir, that's a problem. For any existentialist, that's a problem, because it's a way of not taking responsibility for your role in the positing, creation, maintenance, justification of value, and so on. You don't do the work of committing yourself to it in the eyes of the other. You defer that justification and place it out there into the world and say, well, what choice do I have? It's just the good that I have to follow. Now, she mentions that the infantile state, which has this respect for the world of adults, who thinks that that value just comes writ in stone or like manna from heaven or something like that, cannot really be maintained. And of course, as I've already said, she points to adolescence as a period where this is really disrupted. I had mentioned at the end of my last video that I think Beauvoir says something that is racist here. And I want to spend just a moment to talk about what I find to be adolescent, or what I want to spend a moment just to say what I find to be racist about this. And I think that this is one of those kinds of things where Beauvoir is attempting to be like an anti-racist ally. She's trying to defend what she sees as oppressed people around the world, black slaves or black people living under segregation in the United States, for instance, which is where she goes awry here. And she just doesn't, she falls into some of the traps of allyship, especially be taking a sort of paternalistic tone well, let me just go to the text and I'll tell you what I think the problem is here. She says, right after this discussion of adolescence, So she had already said that she says there are beings whose life slips by in an infantile world because, having been kept in a state of servitude and ignorance, they have no means of breaking the ceiling which is stretched over their heads. Like the child, they can exercise their freedom, but only within this universe which has been set up for them without them. So again, the world of adults is set up before the child arrives in it, and the child arrives into a situation which other people have determined before it even gets there. Both in the sense of it's not made in regard to the child at all, it's just what people have been doing up to that point, but also like the way that parents prepare for the arrival of a child, and they literally like they set up the situation for the child, the nursery and all of that kind of stuff. And she says, and this is the case, for example, of slaves who have not raised themselves to the consciousness of slavery. The Southern planters were not altogether in the wrong in considering the Negroes who docilely submitted to their paternalism as, quote, grown-up children. To the extent that they respected the world of the whites, the situation of the black slaves was exactly an infantile situation. So I think the problem of reducing the consciousness of enslaved peoples to an infantile state is it plays into a racist trope of infantilizing black people particularly, but especially black people living under slavery. And I think that you can look at works by people like Richard Wright, or I'm thinking mostly of literary works right now at the moment, which is fine because they paint a very poignant portrait of the psychology of the oppressed. I think probably it would be better to analyze that under the aegis of bad faith. Like, the slave who has resigned themselves to their position and accepts the world, at some point probably recognizes their freedom that extends beyond the world of the situation created by the slave master. So I think Beauvoir falls a bit into a kind of a standard trope of infantilizing the other, or the slave in this particular case. Though I do think it is true that there is a shift, and this is in the literature about liberation. There is a discussion of the shift of consciousness, of trying to raise consciousness up. Du Bois will talk about the function of like a double consciousness, but again, it's a double consciousness. There comes with it a sort of an awareness of the situation, and having to move between sort of worlds, so to speak, where you can enact your freedom in the limited sphere, or you still have a family and friends and that kind of thing in your own space within the larger, construct. I can't really get into all of the details of double consciousness, but I think Beauvoir sort of hedges a little bit, and she sort of saves herself, I think, if I'm being generous with her, when she says, to the extent that they respected the world of the whites. There is a sort of a hedge. And then later she comes back and she says, the fact is that it is very rare for the infantile world to maintain itself beyond adolescence. So she does some hedging in this section that makes the passage maybe not as bad as it could be, but I still think falls prey to just some sort of prejudicial thinking on Beauvoir's part, and an inelegant expression of a problem that we find. Because the other thing that Beauvoir will point out later is that oppressors will recruit from the ranks of the oppressed people to help support them. And we see that as very true throughout the institution of slavery, in concentration camps run by the Nazis, in colonial situations, in the Congo, and what I mean. There's always an attempt to select people by giving them favors and elevating their position a little bit from within the group that's being put down in order to maintain the system of oppression, to play the oppressed sort of against one another in a way. So Beauvoir's keen on some important features of oppression, but I think here she falls a little short and just stumbles into some racist stereotypes about black people in particular. So I do want to just point that out. And she also talks a little bit about this particular paragraph is just a little rough, I think, when trying to imagine and talk about the situation of women in the harem, for instance, things like that. Suffers from the same sort of problem I just articulated about black slaves in the American South, right? You also have to think, too, of that idea of a metastable condition, right? Even if one is resigned to the situation created by white slaves or the harem owner, that mask might slip a little bit, especially as an adult, where you have a desire that's being frustrated or something like that. There must be at least moments where that revelation hits of like, things must be different outside the world, right? I mean, because the master themselves presents with an example of someone who is not restricted by the confines. And even if someone were just to say, well, if I were the master, I mean, there's already a projection of your freedom into a situation which is uninhibited by the constraints that are placed upon you. Even if you've resigned yourself, sort of in desperation or, well, it is what it is type of attitude to those restrictions, right? So, again, I just think that Beauvoir has committed an error that's somewhat typical of white allies when dealing with anti-black racism or something like that, of infantilizing unnecessarily and in a kind of offensive way oppressed people. So I just wanted to talk for a second about that. So when we move forward from this section here, and again she mentions that it is very rare for the infantile world to maintain itself beyond adolescence, and the flaws begin to be revealed, and then people begin to demand that you participate in such a world. She says, from one point of view, the collapsing of the serious world is a deliverance. Although he was irresponsible, the child also felt himself defenseless before obscure powers which directed the course of things. But whatever the joy of this liberation may be, it is not without great confusion that the adolescent finds himself cast into a world that which is no longer ready-made, which has to be made. He has abandoned, unjustified, the prey of a freedom that is no longer chained up by anything. So that is scary sometimes, to be thrown out into this world once the sort of blinders are taken off and you discover that you are being called to make your values. You also then begin to place your own constraints, right? Because once you begin to make free choices, now you're bound to those, and you can only act in the aftermath of those, right? So that is a difficult thing that will raise a lot of anxiety for people, and it will also create a sense of nostalgia, like, oh, can't I just go back to the childhood in which I didn't have the burden of this responsibility, and so on, right? She says the misfortune comes to man as a result of the fact that he was a child, is that his freedom was first concealed from him, and that all his life he will be nostalgic for a time when he did not know its exigencies, right? So we will become nostalgic for childhood sometimes and wish we could sort of go back to a place where things seemed ready-made, cut and dry, and we could just accept those and not be responsible for these choices. And then there's one other aspect that is a problem for the person who has come into their own freedom. Moral choice is free and therefore unforeseeable. The child does not contain the man he will become, yet it is always on the basis of what he has been that a man decides upon what he will be. So you don't have the seed of some completed adult within you from childhood that will just blossom if you water it correctly or something like that. No, you are creating the person that you will become. And you might have a particular vision and you act, and your actions become a fact that fade into the past, and now you're stuck with those, and those actions that you've made could become a help or a hindrance to the vision of who you want to become. Nothing is sort of guaranteed for you. So again, you are starting to construct your own constraints through your actions. You haven't been liberated from all constraint by escaping the serious world of adults through your adolescent rebellion. You've simply entered into a situation in which the constraints are coming about increasingly from your own choices and decisions. Again, which can lead to nostalgia for childhood, where this isn't the case. And it can also mean that it's unpredictable exactly how you are going to turn out or develop. You might have a vision for yourself in the future that becomes changed and altered through decisions that you make and interactions that you have with other people, and so on and so forth. That line that she gives about this nostalgia plays, I think, very significantly into what she's going to say later about the subman. The underling, I think, is actually a better translation of the idea that she's talking about into English. She's also playing, I think, a bit on Nietzsche, the overman or the Übermensch there. So I'll talk about that a little bit in the next video. This nostalgia feeds into that because, again, all of these psychological profiles that she's going to paint are pictures of people who are trying to flee and escape their freedom. And nostalgia can be a powerful motivator to return to a state in which you didn't have to take ownership of your freedom and make choices and decisions and all of that kind of business. So it is a sort of a motivator for why might someone infantilize themselves, so to speak, by becoming an underling, or go in the other direction and commit themselves to seriousness in a robust way, which is another way of projecting your values into the world. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and I will pick up in the next video with a discussion, and we'll just work our way through in the next couple of videos. I'll try to make them relatively brief, just going through each of these profiles that she paints in the next pages. So, all right, thank you, and I'll see you in the next video.